It's a bit heady, but he asks a profound question. What does it mean to be human? How do we define our humanness? And he doesn't start where most people start. He doesn't start with rationalist arguments, and the reason he said that was that if you start with rationalist arguments to try and prove what makes someone human, then it leaves certain populations with the burden of proof to show that they are human. In other words, if you understand U.S. law, we constitutionally have said until you can think in certain categories, you're not human, which technically means legally, if you're not developed to a certain point, you're technically not human by the standards we use in the U.S. to decide who's human. He doesn't start there. He starts in a very different place. What does it mean to be human? Why is this important? And what he says is what it means to be human is because God has chosen to make us human. And how, and one of the ways in which God has done that is by coming to us as a human. That's interesting. He didn't come as a platypus, which would have been interesting, because that's one of the most interesting creatures God has made. But he didn't come that way. He came as a human. In other words, Paul, now I'm blanking on his letter, Philippians 2, his famous hymn, where he sings about how God emptied himself of what it meant to be God, to become human and be born in our midst. And in Jesus' willingness to do that, God gives over God's whole identity and meaning to Jesus as a gift. God makes himself vulnerable because Jesus made himself vulnerable to become human, born a baby in our midst. And that what makes us human is not some anthropology, because anthropology basically says we're an animal. We just think better than most animals and are more adaptive than most animals, but we're nothing but an animal. He starts with God coming to us and saying, I'm not going to let you destroy yourself. And that's what makes you human. And that our humanity comes in recognizing that we are vulnerable, that we need each other, that we need other people, that we need to connect with other people. And that is the heart and center of our humanity. And so what's interesting is when you think about that in relationship to this passage, this is a very, very powerful passage. But what really, to me, makes it powerful is the humanness of Jesus in it. And the humanness is not found in the miracle he does, although he does that with specific intention, but the humanness is found in how he responds in this particular situation with this particular story. And he's been friends with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We don't know when that friendship started, but we know he was friends, and we know Bethany was 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And if you recall, throughout the Gospels, whenever he goes to Jerusalem, he never spends the night in Jerusalem. Where does he spend the night? He goes out to Bethany and spends the night in Bethany. So Bethany was the place where Jesus rested, probably with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And here he gets word, he's not anywhere near there, he's a few days away, and he gets word that Lazarus is sick. And kind of blows it off, kind of says, well, he's kind of sick, so I can show you God's glory, but, it's not as major as you think, and stays what he's doing for a couple of days. Finally, he decides, I'm going to head there. And in heading there, first off, he has some interactions with his disciples, and he tries to tell his disciples he's going there because something's happened, and he's going to do something because he needs them to see stuff and understand stuff. And of course, in their answers, they still don't get what he's doing, what he's about. They still have in their head that they want the Messiah to come. They want that Messiah to come and fix all the wrong around them and to reestablish Israel as God's chosen people, to bring about God's kingdom here on earth, set things right, make things the way they should be, so that the bad stuff is no longer around. Make it go away and make life better so that we don't have to struggle, we don't have to suffer in the way we do now. And that's what they're yearning for. They think that this Messiah is going to do it. They think Jesus is this Messiah. And he's trying to push them to see and think differently about God, what God's doing, who God is, what God is about. And they're struggling to get it. And so he starts heading back. He gets word that Lazarus is already dead. But he keeps heading toward Bethany to to go there for himself. And as he's approaching it, Martha comes running out to him and meets him. And she's sad because her brother is dead and he's buried. He's been dead and buried for 4 days. And she comes to him and says, if you had come here in time, you could have fixed this. I mean, he had just recently taken a person blind from birth and healed them. You could have fixed him when he was sick. You could have stopped this from happening. You could have kept my loved one from dying. You could have kept me from grieving the way I am grieving and hurting the way I am hurting. And Jesus has this interaction with Martha where he tries to push her understanding of who God is. Tries to push and say this incredible line, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live. And she could only believe in that in her images of who and what the Messiah was, bringing about the end of time, starting the kingdom of God, and raising the dead all at once, and setting all of human history down a different course. That's the only way she could think about it. That's the only way she could hear it. And couldn't hear that he was doing it and meaning it differently. Couldn't understand what's going on. He continues on his way, and Martha goes home, sends Mary. She meets him at the edge of town, and she too is crying. So he goes to the tomb with her. The Jews who were mourning in the house came with. And part of Jewish culture that we miss, and it's not just Jewish culture. A lot of Native people do this. A lot of cultures do this. When you lose a loved one, there are people who come and cry with you to help you cry. Mourners. There are professional mourners whose sole job is to empathize with you, to sit with you, to be with you, to cry with you, to help you cry by their cry, so that you can get the emotional release you need and start working through the grief in a healthy way. And so that group that's going around following Mary is a group of people who are there to help Mary grieve, whose sole job is to cry with her so that she can grieve and can work through this stuff. And they come up to the stone, and we have a couple of lines from Jesus that just amaze me. That when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. It just weighs on me. He was greatly disturbed. He saw these people crying, and it touched his heart. Seeing them go through the pain they're going through. And then he let them feel that pain. He didn't stop it. And their whole talk to him was, if you would come, we wouldn't be going through this. But he was still moved by it. And he says, where have you laid him? They told him. And he says to them, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And then, this is the piece that always moves me the most in this whole passage. Jesus begins to weep. He doesn't stop. He doesn't hold back. He begins to hurt. And he's probably weeping for a lot of things. His friend Lazarus is dead, and he's weeping. Martha struggles to see and understand who he is. His disciples struggle to see and understand who he is. Maybe he's weeping for that too. He's weeping because they're feeling so much pain. He's weeping because they can't get in their imagination that he might still be able to do something. Weeping that they can't see that God can really do new things in our midst. And that all of these things are probably going on as he weeps. But he weeps. He starts crying in their midst. That is a vulnerable God. That is, when Howard Watt says, what does it mean to be human? Is that God chose to be human, come in our midst, and struggle with what we struggle with. Suffer the things we suffer. And here he is, knowing he could change something. Instead, he stops to cry and to weep alongside of and with. Then he tells them, roll away the tombstone, open it up. And they're like, 4 days. He's not smelling good. You probably don't want that stone rolled away. It's going to smell bad. He says, do it anyway. And he calls out to him, and Lazarus gets up, and he walks out. Now, he didn't turn Lazarus into a superhuman. He just took him from a place from being dead to not being dead. He still had to die again. Of course, it'd be interesting to get his diary. Writing, I was dead for 4 days. And, wouldn't that be a fascinating thing to come across? Or to get his diary as he's approaching death for a second time. I died once, now I'm going to die again. It'd be interesting. I'd be curious to know. The folklore is that the Jews at some point had him murdered, but that's folklore. No one really knows, but that's one of the folklore things. But here, this incredible moment, Jesus weeps, and then he calls him forth, and Lazarus gets up, and he walks out. And he says, unbind him. Take the bandages off, set him free. And the old, the dead, is now new and alive and restored to community. What Jesus isn't trying to do is to make a super person. What Jesus did was restored Lazarus to community, to the people who loved him and that he loved. And if you look at all of the different miracles that Jesus does, every one of those miracles is about taking someone who was outside of community and restoring them to community, bringing them back to people, and rebuilding relationships through what he does. And we miss that. And that, again, that whole vulnerability is about people needing people, and he keeps restoring people to people. And that's the beauty and the power of this whole passage to me, is the way in which he cries and then restores Lazarus to people. And it has this wonderful line at the end. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. This story is also the turning point in his ministry in all the Gospels. After this, all of his enemies shift. They're no longer wanting to challenge him, test him, to try and validate, is he the Messiah? From this event on, their goal is, how do we get him dead? How do we put him to death? And if you think about the whole blind man incident, if Jesus is a person of God and is able to take someone blind from birth and make them see, then he potentially could make blind the religious authorities. Well, now he's taking a dead person and made him to life without even touching them. What could he do to the religious authorities if he so chose? You see the threat he suddenly created? So here he is taking someone and simply returning him to community, but the reality is in doing that, he is basically showing a threat to all the established order, that he could undo it. And the authorities get it, and they spend all their time and their energy trying to put him to death. It's one of my favorite novels is Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which was the beginning of the great trilogy he was writing, except that he died before he wrote the other two. So it's the only volume he got written. But in it, one of the main characters are two brothers, actually, Ivan and Alyosha. And Alyosha is a person of a strong, deep Christian faith, and Ivan is a rationalist who doesn't believe in God. And trying to disprove God to him, he tells the story of the Grand Inquisitor, which is a famous passage that people go to in the book. And in it, the story Ivan tells is Jesus returns, and the church and the Pope realizes Jesus, so they quickly have him arrested and thrown in jail. And there's this famous scene where the Pope goes down and talks to him, and while he's chained up and locked up in a dungeon. And basically, he goes to Jesus and says, the people don't want you because you bring freedom and anxiety and the need to choose and act, whereas we've religionized the faith, show that people have order and a set of rules to abide by, and they want the rules and the security and the order. And so we can't let you get out there and interact with the people. And it's this powerful chapter story being told of this interaction with the Pope saying, we gave the people what they wanted because you bring something that is scary. And this story is incredible because it does two things. It shows a scary God taking something that was dead and making it alive and new. And that God works in powerful ways, but does it by restoring people to people, and does it as a vulnerable God who is willing to weep in our midst. And who makes us human by coming to us and wanting to be a part of who we are and what we are. The challenge Jesus gives us in this is, how are we going to find those places where restoration and relationship needs to happen? How are we going to find the people in our life that we are not in community with that we should be? And how do we find healing for that community? How do we find healing for that person? How do we connect with and rebuild relationships that need rebuilding? And that is our challenge. Let us pray.